Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am Davood. I'm here once again with OG Rose and John David on our 11th 12th episode, Essay 11 of Tropics of Discourse. Essay 11 is about Foucault, Michel Foucault. And I should maybe note, we can talk a lot about this essay from different angles. One topic to talk about is why this essay is written, the motivation behind it. And we can note, to begin with, that the essay was published in 1973. And in 1973, Foucault was, I think, about 47 years old. And at the time, he had, I think, 6 books published. So I think a major aim of Hayden White in this essay is to introduce Foucault to the Anglo-American audience, readers, especially readers who are interested in history and philosophy of history. I think he has a lot of sympathy for Foucault, and Foucault as a critic of social sciences, social and human sciences, and how he relies heavily on one work by Foucault. The Order of Things is the English title of the work, and one of the things that Foucault does is he challenges the assumption that social sciences use their terminology, use their conceptual systems, conceptual structures to inform us about things, the order of things, how things are in society, in human lives, in human communities. So things and words, that distinction is something that Foucault challenges. There's a beautiful passage towards the end of the essay that I want to read, but let's hear some opening remarks first. Daniel.
Well, I really enjoyed those introductory remarks, and I didn't think about that. That's probably true that Mr. White is trying to introduce Foucault to an American audience. In the year 2021, it can be difficult, especially if you have any involvement with a university system or higher education or education, to have not heard of Foucault and the roles of power and control and episteme and biopower and normalization. One of the things you mentioned, the beautiful passage at the end. We were speaking before we started recording. John was making the great point that Mr. White walks us through for a good 2/3 of the essay on what Foucault's thinking is about. And now, as you say, that Davood makes sense because he's trying to bring people up to speed on what Foucault is saying. That makes sense. We're at the end, for the last part of the essay, Mr. White seems to be making a claim which I thought came together in the very last sentence of it, where he says, Foucault too, I'll read from it's the very last line, which I thought captured it very nice. He says, to transform prose into poetry is Foucault's purpose, and thus he is especially interested in showing how all systems of thought in the human sciences can be seen as little more than terminological formalizations of poetic closure with the world of words, rather than with the things they purport to represent and explain. And I may have stolen the passage you wanted to read, Davood. Do forgive. We'll go into it. But what's so interesting is this whole time, Mr. White has been trying to make different arguments in these essays that history is literary, but that doesn't mean it is fiction. It can have a literary or genre structure, and that is just the mode. But it's not the case that you don't get truth from literature. Well, Foucault right here might be telling us that basically science and all forms of knowledge have a literary structure. So Mr. White is like, so what I'm doing is not such a big deal, guys. Stop accusing me of relativism, because this might just be what everyone in different forms is doing. Any sort of ordering of things can have a certain structuring using words, using language. I think Foucault in the Order of Things focuses on biology, linguistics, and economics as really some of the 3 fields he really wants to focus on. And to really be talking about how the structures of these fields in of themselves have to be the order of, say, a science has to have an ordering principle behind it. And what he wants to examine is that ordering principle, in the same way that if you have a story, there has to be an author behind that story. And so if you just sort of examine what happens in the story, but you don't ask the questions of, that would not be the same questions as asking why the writer chose to write that story, right? So likewise, say, examining the field of say biology would not necessarily, in learning all the facts and the way the world is ordered according to biology, would not necessarily tell you the minds of whom are doing the ordering behind that science. So he wants to get at those different things. So basically, he can say these realms of knowledge are structured. There's a certain structure to them that for Foucault is going to, I think the term is normalizing power. There are these Epsteins and there's these sort of ways that knowledge is ordered in a manner that is going to bind people to think a certain way that they're not even going to think to question, that it's just going to be part of the air. So, to pass it on to John here, I think what's interesting is White, if we take Foucault seriously, and in the order of things, then it just kind of further gives credence to Mr. White's case that history is literary, and that doesn't mean history is false. Now, I will say as a slight point, I think Foucault's use of the term power actually makes it harder to get what Foucault is getting at, because power is very loaded. Where Foucault is going to say everyone is under power, even say the leaders of business. There's not simply the repressive power of the boss at work telling employees to do something. There's also the idea that you should be at work, which is part of the air of capitalism that even the boss is under. So even the leaders and the controlling people can be under the normalizing power of the society. Well, power sounds, one of the problems is power can sound like someone is orchestrating the whole thing when it might just be an emergent result of the sociological order. It might be something more like givens. So I will note here that I think Foucault, toward the end of his life, started to kind of go, well, what would a society look like without any normalizing power at all? And then he actually started to seemingly reverse, and some people even say became conservative toward the end of his life. So that's something to note, that when we talk about Foucault and power, thinking about sociological givens, like givenness, like what is given when you wake up in the morning and do, can be a helpful way to think about it, like Philip Reeve. But anyway, the main point is that Foucault's understanding of the structures of knowledge gives credence that Mr. White is not doing something so terrible to be suggesting that history has a literary structure to it.
I think that the idea that power is maybe not always the greatest word because of the way we use it colloquially in English is something really important to point out. Water has ultimate power over the lives of fish, right?
Yes.
Do fish notice that water in any meaningful way? Probably not. Right. It's sometimes power is something you're so thoroughly ideologically steeped in that you can't even see its workings in front of your eyes, and that's also the way he's using the word power. So the sciences for Foucault are, I think what White says towards the end is that the science is about trying to take something, let me see if I can find the quote, something that we are inherently unfamiliar with, like some phenomenon like life or some body of inquiry, and trying to distill it into something we think is fundamental and immovable and absolutely capable of being able to be communicated clearly and transparently. And that's usually language, say. So if you take a field like history and you try to use language to communicate it, that might be somewhat of a scientific endeavor. I might call it a humanity. The lines there are blurred, of course. But in science, they really sort of assume the crystalline quality of language itself. And the problem, as I think social scientists started to realize mostly in the 19th century and certainly in the 20th, is that language has its own problems. And that with Saussure, we find that the sign, the signifier, and the signified has its own set of issues, and that language has its own sort of slipperiness. But for some reason, around the 16th century or so, when science made it split from the other branches of human knowledge, it walked away with this sense of empowerment, maybe not totally deserved, that it thought it could ground everything in a more certain, absolute way. But then I think he's trying to say that Foucault is maybe one of the most important of the last people when he's writing, to whose work shows that assumption is wrong in so many ways, and that it needs to be excavated, and that for reasons that we can go into later, you need more of an archaeology of the human sciences than a history of them.
Yeah, let's pause on that word a little bit, archaeology, and why it's different from historiography. So in my understanding, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, historiography or history of an object is the attitude of looking at an object or looking at a house, a building, an artifact, and by inspecting it, kind of getting access to its past, getting access to how this very object that is right in front of us was part of another time, participated in a different time in history. Archaeology suggests going deeper, like digging and revealing things that are hidden from our view right now. Instead of looking at the objects that are present in our view now, digging in and finding new objects, and with those discoveries, getting access to a time that was so radically different from our time that its objects, its corresponding objects, its corresponding ordering principles, the principles, its structures are hidden from our view because they're so inconsistent and incompatible. Would you agree with that characterization of archaeology?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at that passage. It is from the last 2 pages, beginning towards the bottom of page 258. So here, what Hayden White is doing is he's situating Foucault within the structuralist tradition. And he is pointing out how it is not enough for us to know that Foucault had something to do with structuralists. That's a structuralist intellectual movement. We need to know something more about structuralism and Foucault's particular relationship with structuralism and what he did with it. So he writes, we should distinguish between 2 wings of the structuralist movement: the positivist, to which we may assign Saussure, Piaget, Goldman, and the Marxists such as Althusser and the late Lucien Sebag. I don't know that person. And the eschatological, so positivist on the one hand and eschatological wing on the other hand, to which Lacan, Lévi-Strauss, Barthes, Foucault, and Foucault himself belong. The positivist wing has been concerned with the scientific determination of the structures of consciousness by which men form a conception of the world they inhabit, and on the basis of which they contrive modes of praxis for coming to terms with that world. Their conception of structure is primarily a functionalist or pragmatic one. The eschatological wing, by contrast, concentrates on the way in which structures of consciousness actually conceal the reality of the world, and by that concealment effectively isolate men within different, not to say mutually exclusive, universes of discourse, thought, and action. So let's say I'm a psychologist, you're a sociologist or historian. Because of our belonging to those different structures, we actually become isolated from each other. And each of our modes of engagement with our subject matter kind of, it means that we have boundaries between us as a result of that. And different things are concealed from us. The former wing, we may say, is integrative in its aim insofar as it envisages a structure of structures by which different modes of thought and practice might be shown to manifest in a unified level of human consciousness shared by all men, everywhere, whatever cultural differences they might exhibit. The latter wing is ultimately dispersive in as much as it leads thought into the interior of a given mode of consciousness, where all of its essential mystery, opaqueness, and particularity are celebrated as evidence of the irreducible variety of human nature. Yeah. So this is, to me, really helped understanding Foucault's project. And it is, I think, Hayden White's own terminology, eschatological versus positivist. He's more concerned with what is concealed with a paradigm of inquiry, to use Thomas Kuhn's word, rather than what is enabled by it. And what are the particularities of a given discipline. And one last thing about the term power, which you both touched on. It reminded me of how sexuality is used by Freud. And I think Foucault uses power and the way he employs power is similar to how Freud uses sexuality, which is very general. For Freud, sexuality is something
like a generalized drive, right?
Right. Something that we invest, something that we find expressions for, and for Foucault, similarly, power is like an ordering principle. The ways, something that makes things arrange themselves in the way that they are, or arrange words, organize words. Okay, any responses to that passage or anything else?
I have. So when we get into the actual the first 2/3 of it, it talks about, I guess he might have such an affinity for Foucault because he, at least in the order of things, he has a fourfold. And we know how White loves his fourfold definitions, squares of things. He talks about the four stages of, a couple of them, like the history of mental illness, for example, and how we think about sanity versus insanity. And he talks about another one is how we look for the first stage when science sort of broke off from the other fields of human knowledge is science looked for similarities, and then it looked for differences, and then it looked for contingencies in space and time. And that sort of made me think that you just mentioned Kuhn. How do these changes, if he doesn't really want to talk about, if he's really suspicious of cause and effect, how do these changes come about? I mean, is there like a critical mass of, when you get to some point and you're talking about, when he's discussing the science in the 17th century, he says there's some point where when you're using science to only talk about and suss out similarities, that you ultimately come to a point where all you can see is differences because you've sussed out all the similarities. And then things sort of just take this Kuhnian shift, right? I was sort of wondering how the mechanics of that might work. He doesn't go too much into it, but I was wondering if anyone might have any ideas.
Yeah, that's a great point to pause on. Daniel, please, you want to start?
Well, a few that I was going to comment. One of the ways I think about the differences, whether it's right or wrong, or general, I'm not sure, between Kuhn and Foucault, is that in some respects, it would seem the paradigm are conscious rules or the conscious kind of parameters that science is operating on, where the episteme is more unconscious, sort of the stuff in the background. And then you have this weird thing where sometimes the paradigm shifts, which may cause the episteme to switch, but then sometimes the episteme can switch first, and that will change the paradigm. It's not actually, I'm not sure if it's always one or the other. Where with the, obviously the paradigm, the introduction of quantum mechanics would be a kind of paradigm shift, or general relativity would be a paradigm shift, but it would not necessarily be a transformation of the language or the subconscious biases or the economic considerations of the scientists who are undergoing that paradigm shift. Whereas in another, maybe within during between first decade and second decade of quantum mechanics, maybe there's an episteme change because there's a different funding mechanism that comes around that makes people concerned and focused on different things and have different biases. So that's one way I think about it. Whether that's right or wrong is another matter.
So one would be like a major change in the models that we understand the phenomenon, and the other would be a major change in the background noise of what science is doing itself.
Yes, that's correct. That's how I would take it. Now, I don't necessarily know if we can say it's always one before the other, if it can change, because I think the question you're asking, John, is quite good. Like, did we go to difference because similarity was exhausted and then you get to difference? I think this is where Foucault, if I recall, I do think economics for him means a lot, because, for example, if economics keeps you from having to trade with other groups and you're not on the Silk Road, for example, well, then you can have a science of similarity because you don't ever encounter a radical difference, right? But then if maybe you have a society that then has a giant earthquake, before the Enlightenment, that makes everything feel transient, and so that you might get a focus on contingency. Whereas today, for example, with pluralism, something that defines us is this actually this realization that the logic that holds societies together, the givens, is kind of ultimately random and arbitrary, or can be based on geography, right? Like why the West emphasizes freedom so much may have something to do with the fact it's got two oceans around it, right? And then freedom becomes this prime metaphysical principle that no one, it's the unquestioned, well, of course, freedom is the highest value. Well, that's contingent upon being in a society that can think that way, because you generally don't have to worry so much about your borders, right? That's just kind of an example. And so once you realize, like once the society becomes conscious about that, then that can affect, what we focus on in science and different things, and so on. I think that's extremely valuable. And in the same way, as I understand what Mr. White is telling us about Foucault, White has told us earlier in this collection that if we don't think about history as literary, then we're not going to think about the words we use. We're not going to think about the structures. And as a result, we're going to do history poorly. In a very similar way would be, it's kind of Foucault's like, if we don't think about the fact that the language we use and the subconscious biases and things impacts the science we do, we are going to do science poorly, or we're not going to realize how the language carries the science. I think a way to make this example, and then I'll pass it on. And I think this may have been in here, or I read it somewhere, I don't recall, where if I use the language of saying, you are in the grips of the flu, like this metaphoric language of saying you are in the grips of an illness, versus I say, well, you're infected by the flu. Well, the language of you're in the grips of the flu kind of sounds environmental. It sounds like you're in the wrong location, because that makes you be in the grip. So maybe my scientific investigation would be to focus on the environmental influences like temperature or sunlight or things, and how that affects to you having the flu. Whereas if I talk about you are infected by the flu, well, that may put all the focus on diet or, your internal organ system or blood. There can be a different focus. And here's the thing. There is no reason why scientific investigations to the environment can't stay on the environment forever. You could always think of another temperature difference to study, another experiment to do. You could always explore the possible impacts of environment on the flu, because you're being directed by the language of in the grips of. And maybe you'd get 50% of what you discovered would be true. Heck, maybe you'd find countless discoveries that would be very useful, but there would be this whole domain of health that you will not have even thought to have experimented in, involving the internal system, which because of the language, you're not even realizing you're missing. And so that's the kind of thing, like when I think about what Foucault's warning about is as an example, and he of course talks a lot more than just language, but and that even ties, I guess, to the Susan Sontag metaphors of illness. But that's a way to think about it. So again, to what you were saying, Davood, and then I'll pass it. It's like, it would almost be like Foucault would say, hey guys, wait a minute, or at least White's version of Foucault would be, hey, before we spend all that time investigating the impact of the environment on illness, let's ask ourselves the question if the language of in the grips of is contributing to us focusing on that kind of experimentation, and if that's the right direction we want to go in, as opposed to just assuming it because the language is carrying us along, like the water the fish are in, that they don't even realize that they're in.
But let me add one thing to that. There is, I was one of those nerdy high school kids who was interested in debates about, the existence of God and, what reasons there might be for such a being. And people would often say, well, cells contain information. And who could have possibly put that information there? And information is inherent in DNA. Well, you would never hear a biologist talk like that, or use that word, use those words. You would hear a biologist talk about how messenger RNA interacts in certain polar, non-polar ways with deoxyribonucleic acid, and is copied, goes to ribosomes where proteins are created. So the way that you talk or think, the metaphors that you have in your mind about a certain subject shape so many things that you think about it.
Oh yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent.
John, we previously asked what happens that, I think this is this is a key point in this and the previous essay, one of the previous essays on Vico. What is it that undermines, or in the long run, undermines a paradigm? It could be, Daniel talked about this possibility that some people will come and they are creative and they creatively come up with a different metaphor. That is certainly true and possible, but there's another destructive internal factor from within a paradigm, within a system of thought and approach, that in the long term kind of reveals its own contradictions. And that we saw that with Vico, and how the age of God, as Vico identified, age of God necessarily leads to the age of heroes, because people keep asking questions about gods and realize the inconsistencies and contradictions with that way of thinking. And they want some more concrete reference to discuss, to attribute agency to. So they talk about heroes. But then heroes, well, they realize that heroes cannot be fully responsible for everything, for everything that happens in a society and civilization. So they say, okay, people in general. So we turn from the age of heroes to the age of men. And I think White detects a similar pattern in Foucault's thinking, that these internal contradictions, inconsistencies, and how the way we talk kind of keeps hitting against stubborn reality, which we don't fully understand. And that reveals to us the failure of our metaphors and the incompleteness or inadequacies of our metaphor in the long term.
I was also really interested in, he's talking about, I think maybe the transition from the second to the third stage of science, where in the second we have the quote unquote, the people who have been classified as insane being locked up with criminals. So the insane being put in prison, sort of like with this, panopticon sort of thing. But it just so happens that at roughly the same time as the starting up of the Industrial Revolution, the medical field in people like Pinet, Philippe Pinet, I think, the neuroscientist, starts to realize that insane people don't belong with poor people, because poor people don't need the same kind of help. So they release the poor people, which just happens to allow a huge flood of labor into the market. Right. What are the chances, right?
What a coincidence.
and that is a very cynical reading of capitalism, but it does make you ask a lot of questions about how science is affected consciously or unconsciously by economic factors, and not just the obvious ones of, well, am I going to get enough funding to do this research project, but much more hidden ones that don't really seem related. But I think that to think of everything as ultimately boiling down to power seems awfully, maybe it's because I share Foucault's cynicism, it seems awfully convincing to me. I know it's probably not that simple, but it speaks loudly to me.
I want to read one line before passing to Daniel. It's extremely interesting, captivating to me. He writes at the bottom of page 249 that in the human sciences of the modern age, language has been treated in the same way that madness was treated in the age of reason. So what does that mean? That we might treat language in the same way that people treated madness. So I think we ask language to just behave. If somebody's talking to us about biology, some biological facts, and say, just use plain language, please. I want your language to be transparent, to stay out of the way. I don't
say
want
what you mean and mean what you say.
Yeah. So don't keep, just like how in the age of reason, people wanted to deny the importance and significance of people who were judged as insane. They wanted to stay out of the way, to be transparent, to be treated as unimportant and accidental, just contingent facts. We might end up treating language in that way, underestimating its power.
A few things. If we can define, this group of people is mad, this group of people is sane, all we have to do is get rid of them, and then we're good to go. Likewise, if language is simply bad language, good language, just kind of cut this out, and then we'll get to truth. And of course, it will happen to be the case that this language will serve the interests of the power structures at the time. To what John was saying, I think Foucault's notion of power is very, very compelling. I think it would be a different topic. Another way to help think of Foucault, I think actually is in terms of Kafka novels. And I saw a lecture a long time about this. It was really compelling on the idea that the powers that be and the people all emergently give rise to this sort of structure that cannot be located in a single individual that people willingly participate in, like Joseph K. He rings the bell at the beginning of the trial to summon the police. They offer him the knife at the end. He willingly compels himself deeper and deeper into the trial, getting himself more and more in trouble. But then when you try to locate like who exactly accused him of the crime and what is the, nobody knows. And the judges themselves are kind of forced to play this role by this structure. And so there's this kind of emergent principle of power that's sort of operating in crazy ways. And then, you can always get a blend, right? Where you have some instances where, because when you talk about power, you get into questions of masterminds and do people like organize power? And it would seem like there are times where that is the case. Then there are other times where we make our tools and then our tools make us. We make our power and then our power makes up, where then it gets out of control. But then maybe in the area of economics, it's more controlled, in politics now, so it can get all sort of mixed. But there's some emergent organizing principle that people then willingly submit to. And that's kind of Foucault's point, right? Is that you would, you're really controlled when there are certain thoughts you wouldn't even think. And the thoughts you do have that make you fall in line with interests, powerful interests, you think are your own and that you want to do. Like, it's one thing to force people to do something you want them to do. It's an entirely another thing to convince them that wanting to do that is what they want to do. And that's how you really kind of control them. And so I think, again, thinking of Foucault in those kind of terms, well, and then again, if you're not thinking in terms of the entire structure that knowledge in the society is operating within, and you're just trying to locate, say, the one person who's controlling everything, and let's say you get rid of that dictator, well, the structure is still there. So it's just going to come back, and the citizens themselves are going to continue to participate in it. In a very similar way that Mr. White has sort of pointed out, that if you're not aware of, say, if you're a historian who's not aware of the genre you're writing in, then maybe if you say, well, this historical account is not correct or it's not as good, well, if that structure is not questioned, you're just going to keep creating new historical accounts that make those same mistakes. So there's a similar not losing the forest through the trees. I think that's an operation that Foucault is trying to bring to our attention. And a similar thing, I think, actually applies as well into disciplines. But ironically, again, I think and then I'll pass it on, accepting this reality is very difficult, because it's one thing to say we can change society once you remove the bad people. But it's an entirely another thing to start talking about a structure of power that citizens themselves want to participate in, don't even realize they want to participate. And you have to convince them that those desires are not their own. It's given to them by the structure. And then to change that structure. And then, of course, what are you going to change it into? That's not going to just re-facilitate new problems of power. You open this entire can of worms. In the same way that if you start talking about history as literature or having a literary structure, then you have to get people to think an entirely different way. They have to read a lot of history and have a dialectic between the different types. And that makes it much more difficult. It ups the ante on the work. So that's all to say, one of the reasons why power does actually come to operate in some of the ways that Foucault discusses is, in fact, because there's a simplifying element to it. Like, people want it. Like, we'll just accept the givens. You just accept the order of things. And then it's not going to open this entire can of worms that you have to think about. And what are we going to structure? And that's another way why it's so difficult to break down these structures, in the same way that it's hard to change your biases on the idea of how history is supposed to be done. Because if you take what White is saying seriously, then you have to think a lot harder about what you're doing in history and what you read.
I sort of wondered to the degree to which his idea of order, or maybe the lack thereof in human sciences, is reflective or parallel to the way that we other the insane.
Yes.
That establishing an order runs parallel to that, the line between saying what sane people are and what insane people aren't, and that maintaining the order means putting the insane people somewhere where they cannot affect the social order, like in prison. At the beginning, just for an example, of the Middle Ages, when the Christian Church was coming quickly to the height of its power and its riches, you would see these small Catholic sects who would say, you must give up everything except the rags on your back to the poor. And you must be the poorest of the poor. And the church saw that I don't know about that. And they would kill them, burn them, exile them, Look at the McCarthy hearings. That's all about othering. Because anything vaguely anti-capitalist is, questioning American order, the American economic order, and American supposed supremacy. And those are just two examples. You could name dozens throughout history. It's interesting to see how we marginalize and use pejorative language and try to push out people that question overarching assumptions that most people don't even, intellectuals, I guess, question them, but the average person just sort of works within and is the water to the fish, just sort of the unthinking atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. And I think, isn't that why for Foucault and for structuralists like him, the eschatological structuralists, it is very valuable to point to strange phenomena and making what is familiar strange. John, you talked about this in the beginning, because that in those phenomena we come to realize the limits of our language and the mismatch between our ability to describe things, the order of things according to our language, and the order of things according to the phenomena, especially strange phenomena, mysterious phenomena.
And he talks about one of the reasons he says that Foucault isn't exactly a historian or a historiographer is because those two camps of people aim to look at largely continuities, similarities, large narratives, where Foucault is more interested in ruptures and discontinuities. That was interesting too.
Well, and that reminded me, I was going to note, Foucault, when he was young, had a teacher that he adored, who was a very famous Hegelian scholar. And this notion that you were mentioning, Davood, on when you have an age reach this, I don't remember, John, the name of it.
Alexander Kohevi?
Maybe. Oh, well, I guess he wrote a lot on Hegel. And I do think Foucault read that translation, actually. I'm not sure if that was his teacher, though, I guess when he was a teenager. But, like you were saying, Davood, in Hegel, there's this idea that an age, when it reaches this point where it's totally, the moment of totalization is precisely the moment when it is recognized that it cannot totalize, that unveils that it's actually a map, because it unveils that it's not the territory. And that's the moment where it actually turns out, wait, we thought this was the territory, but actually it's a map because it can't totalize. And if it can't totalize, that means it's not the territory per se. And so boom, it's like disillusionment in a sense. It's unveiled with what you're working at, and then it changes. That is definitely an operation in Foucault.
By the way, and that is, I believe, that is why we are at the age where scientists hyper-specialize, because by refusing to totalize, they kind of refuse to face their own limits. They don't make those grand gestures. They don't make those big promises. They stay small, stay on their narrow paths of specializing, having expertise in a very, very narrow domain, and they won't be challenged in this way that Foucault offers this challenge. They kind of immunize themselves by being hyper-specialized.
Which I think that's an excellent observation. And that would all be well and good if the people doing the specialization remembers the things that Foucault is talking about and brings that into the specialization, so they don't operate according to certain assumptions and so on, that they don't realize they're doing it. Because if they're not going to do the totalizing thing, the mechanisms that Foucault is describing won't be unveiled in the moment of the totalization that realizes that forces you to acknowledge that totalization cannot occur. So you don't get the mechanisms revealed to you that way. Well, that would mean you need to, when you go into specialization, remember those mechanisms, like bring the knowledge of those mechanisms to the specialization. Because if you do not, there's still going to be an operation, but it's no longer destined to have a failure of totalization to unveil them to you. So that's actually where there's this kind of humility. It says, oh, well, we know totalization is going to fail, so we're going to specialize. But actually that can conceal you from acknowledging the mechanisms. And so, but only the person who's doing the specialization can know if they're doing that or not. So it becomes very, we have to have a lot of faith in them to do the right thing. And I guess you could say something similar in a lot of the different areas. And I was going, the other thing I was going to note, first, I wanted to make a point on what John was saying on the sick and the releasing the poor. In another similar way, how do people determine how sick they are? By if they can go to work or not? Like you're really sick if you can't go to work. You're not that sick if you can still go to work. Your ability to participate in the economy influences how you gauge the severity of your sickness, right? Or if it could get other workers sick and keep them from going to work, so then you should not go, right? So that's just kind of an example where we may determine the severity of a sickness in non-scientific terms, non-biological terms. We're going to determine it in terms of economics. And it's that sort of interplay that Foucault wants us to pay attention to. We as the scientists may say, well, you can determine how severe a sickness is by the fever, by the temperature, by if you can move or not, when actually in the real world, people determine how severe they are by if they can go to work or not. And that, of course, is also influenced by what their boss will allow them not to go to work or not. So it's a much more so it's that kind of interplay that I think Foucault wants to discuss. And lastly, and then I'll pass it on, what you're describing too, I think gets into why Deleuze, who's, him and Foucault talk a lot, Deleuze is going to talk about being a individual who cannot be, I think he doesn't use this language, but calculated, computerized, to be so different that the only way to escape the system is to not be comprehensible by the system. And I think the language is the line of flight, because if you can be comprehended, well, then that means you can be controlled, and you could even get, algorithms now calculate your next move and so on and so forth. So the only way to avoid that is to not be calculatable. And that's where Deleuze will get into anti-edifice and schizophrenia, and because those are all lines of flight, which, and then I'll move on, toward the end of Foucault's life, he did there is this question of, okay, so people are controlled by societal givens, but also people don't want total freedom, because if you give them total freedom, it's existentially overwhelming. It's like Erich Fromm, they don't want to have to think about everything. There's some difficulties, but people actually want a certain level of order. But of course, if there's any level of order, then it's basically inevitable that powered interests are going to push that too far. So how do you fight that? But then how do you, and it became very difficult. And, if you can't figure out that balance, well, then you start thinking about lines of flight like Deleuze. That's a different direction to sort of solve the dilemma of not being calculatable, not being computable in different things. So those are kind of different ways to approach those problems.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've kind of made explicit the transition between the first part of the essay and the second one, but this is the top of 252, where he's talking about largely the failure of social scientists, or I guess people working in the humanities to question the supposed transparency of language. He says, in part, as Foucault points out, the dream of the value-neutral language of the human sciences was inspired by the success of the physical sciences in applying stipulated languages and mathematical protocols to the analysis of their data. And this had an important effect on the development of attitudes within the human sciences with respect to the problem of language in general. It had the effect of concealing to the practitioners of the human sciences the extent to which the very constitution of their field of study was bringing everything back again to the first part of the book, the first several essays, a poetic act, a genuine act of making, a poesis of invention of a domain of inquiry. Mm-hmm. It's not pre-cut out. We have actually shaped these sciences ourselves by the nature of the questions that we asked of them, in which not only specific nodes of representation are sanctioned and others excluded, but also the very contents of perception are determined. And then he goes on in the next to integrate even more language that he's used previously, identifying certain scientific disciplines as styles. And he sort of pushes that metaphor between the humanities and what he has said earlier. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a good way to transition into the second part.
Yeah,
absolutely. There's so much we can say on that. Just one quick footnote is just like how the social scientists were inspired by the rigor and mathematics and mathematical model of physics. Nowadays, we have people in social sciences who are inspired by big data and the rigor and the predictive power that big data has, these predictive algorithms. And it doesn't matter anymore that those algorithms are serving specific interests having to do maybe with, if you have bought these books, what else are you likely to buy? And the algorithm will give a prediction with maybe 65% accuracy. A social scientist wants to just forget that where that interest comes from and just have the rigor, have the benefits, and then be celebrated as a very mathematical scientist with great tools and the language, the right language for describing things.
And not to be cynical again, but what are those algorithms being deployed for? Buying and selling.
Yeah.
Right.
The very core of the capitalist enterprise.
That's right.
Which is interested in keeping itself in the background.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. It is 10:05. Any final thoughts?
Well, I did want to thank John for reading that section, because that is, I thought, the best paragraph of the whole, the end where he brings it all together, because I think what he's done here, if we think about the last few essays, so we've talked about the noble savage, which is kind of described that we define us versus them in terms of literature. We've described the formation of societies in Foucault as a relationship with the signifier. And now we're starting to talk about Foucault as all fields of knowledge having a poetic dimension to them. And you can see, so maybe these random essays have something where you're making a claim about how the role of the poetic is more widespread, which then, if you take that seriously, it makes what Hayden White is saying about history as being literary much more palatable. And you start seeing that it's not just relativism, but it's the nature. It has something to do with the nature of knowledge itself. The last thing I was going to say is, and I do also want to note before I say that last thing, so the second thing is that Foucault is not necessarily always saying that the use of power is bad. It has a tendency to be bad. Not all orders are bad. They can help people. The problem is the more unconscious they become and the more background they get. And it also seems to be the more economic power grew. It does seem to be that that's a big deal, that the likelihood of power being used. You almost could make a distinction between order and oppressive order. These different things, that order always has a tendency toward oppressive order, but you also don't want to have no sense of order at all, because then the universe is not chaotic. But Foucault has also does a very, very good job of showing how order, unfortunately, has a trajectory toward control. And how can that be stopped? In the same way that Hayden White gets accused of relativism, when saying history is literary does not mean it is all relative. It just means there's a different mode of thinking. Foucault is inviting us to a different mode of thinking about what's going on, so we can make sure that, like you're describing, we're not controlled by algorithms, right? Because if we're not aware of that, then we are going to be controlled. But the last thing I was going to say, throughout this essay, he kept bringing up the Mallarmé, I can't ever pronounce it, quote, where things exist in order to live in books. This idea that everything exists is to be live in book. Well, that would suggest, if there's some truth to that things in their nature can exist in books, that would mean they have some sort of structure, some sort of possibility in them ontologically almost, that is brought out and made most intelligible in the structure of literature and the poetic. And I think that is sort of a case that Mr. White has been making in many different forms.
I wanted to say, with one essay to go, and of course, let the last essay blow this out of the water and have it come from left field. But looking at the 12 essays, I did not realize how overall cohesive they would be in their theme.
Yeah.
I was very pleased with how they, with very, very few exceptions, they all seem to coalesce around a certain idea. And I thought they would just sort of be, strictly by looking at the titles, but see Foucault and Vico and tropological, and it doesn't really distill into anything meaningful until you actually wrestle with the ideas and see where he's going with them. And I appreciated the fact that they were all as related as they were.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. Especially given that they were published before as journal articles.
Yeah.
Yes.
That might raise some suspicion, but there was
Yes.
Connection between them. I agree. And it is rewarding for that reason, spending time in this way with the essays. It has been rewarding. And next time, we are going to talk about essay number 12, which is titled The Absurdist Moment in Contemporary Literary Theory. Not history or historiography, but literary theory. Wow. I'm curious.
Yeah, I am too. I thought he was going to be talking about Artaud when I saw absurdism, but I guess not literary theory. But it'll be interesting.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you.
See you next time.